Hi, I'm Amritish from Purple Pencil Project. I'll just straight away start with the questions.
Okay.
How's your experience been at JLF this year?
Well, it's been a bit hectic. I'm in India for the first time after 5 years because of the pandemic, and then there's been the Booker Award, so my time is not my own and it's been very busy.
Okay, so can you please briefly walk us through how you translate? Because it's often difficult to capture the regionalities on all these different things that come back, especially with a novel, let's say when you're translating with Somali, something like that.
hmm
So, how do you go about translating that? What's your process?
Well, I usually do a first draft that's very rough. I write it by hand, and I just like I don't try to solve big problems. So I just I try to get the whole thing down in English, but it's a big mess and there's like notes everywhere and drawings and things like that. And then I type it in on the computer. And then I start like reaching out to people if I need, if there's like something in a dialect or, it's a Punjabi or, something like that. So I reach out to people to help me, and I get more into the dictionary zone of translation. But I always ignore all the poetry and songs, or there's always a lot of poetry and songs in Hindi and Urdu literature. So I leave them in the original language until maybe 5 drafts in. And then because it's a different thought process to translate that kind of thing. And then I usually, it would take about 10 drafts to be ready to go to an editor. Like that's, I always tell people it's the minimum. You should do 10 drafts because you have to make a journey from the original text into the new text. And some things you don't notice that sound bad or you're doing wrong until you're like 6 or 7 drafts out. Suddenly something pops up because it's becoming an English piece of writing, and you suddenly realize that there's a lot that's undone.
So you go through that many drafts, and after that also the editing process. How's the like? Do you have? Is that a difficult process? Can you like walk us through the thing? Because when you're translating that, you also have a book in mind because you are also translating as a reader also.
Right.
So how does that work out? Like, how do you work that I want to keep it this way and not have it because in your mind might be something different, but you think that it would be better for the target audience in a different way, or is that something?
Well, I mean, I feel you have to try to recreate the voice of the author in a new language, and so it's sort of almost mystical because you have to channel the author's voice in a new language. So you have to think like, if they were writing in English, how would they handle this? That's kind of how I do it. It's sort of empathy and kind of channeling and very mystical type of process. Yeah.
I have one question for you, Daisy.
Yeah.
At what point do you let go of the original text and read only the translation and sort of not compare or just check if you've covered everything or something like that?
Yeah.
At what point does that happen?
Well, I mean, by the 3rd draft or something like that, I'm usually not spending very much time with the original, so pretty early on. But there are times when you have to go back because you realize something is off, or you can even skip things sometimes because your eye just jumps around and you realize that doesn't make sense, and you go and find out you left out 3 sentences or something like that. So you have to go back sometimes. But by like draft 7 or 8, it's the original is no longer in the picture, and I always tell my mentees, the people that I work with, that you have to say goodbye to the Hindi and embrace the English text, and that's only by doing that can you make it come alive in a new language.
I realize this would have probably been asked of you quite a few times, but how has your life changed after the book?
Well, I mean, the Booker changes everything because, translators often work in the shadows and are kind of invisible figures, and so you suddenly step out of the shadows, and it's an unusual feeling because we don't do it for the fame and the glory, so having fame and glory is kind of bizarre.
So I know the answer, but I want to ask you, Daisy, how do you go about your translation process? How do you prepare yourself for a day in translation, let's say?
Well, I usually do it in the afternoon. Like I walk a lot in the morning. I live in the country, so I take a long walk and have lunch, and then I start to work. And usually I'm working on a few projects that are in different phases. So those first drafts are by hand, or I'm just kind of alone with the original text, and then I might be working on something else that I'm polishing. So it'd be like maybe 2 hours of each scattered through the rest of the afternoon. And as I've said a bunch of times, my translation really took off when I became a mother because my time was kind of cut up, you know. So it was something that I could squeeze into little segments. And my daughter is a dancer, so I take her to dance class. And I can just sit in the waiting room and write up, and people have no idea what I'm doing, but I just sit there scribbling away, and there's music coming from 3 different places, but I don't mind, and parents coming, or little girls in tutus and things like that. Yeah.
I was going to ask the same question. What are you reading right now? What can we expect from you next? Looking forward to your next.
Well, the things I'm working on now are Geetanjali's only untranslated novel, Hamara Shaher Us Baras.
I've been reading that book.
Yes, yes.
It's such a wonderful book.
Yeah,
Oh
it's
God,
a
I'm so
wonderful.
happy that you started reading.
So yeah, it's our most political work.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, so we've had to kind of sit down before we decided we would do this and say, yes, we're prepared for political ramifications of getting this work out, but it seems so important, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm working on that, and then on a 1955 Urdu novel that's by a Pashtun woman author. And I like to say it's Middlemarch meets Magic Mountain in the Northwest Frontier provinces. So there's this fiercely intellectual heroine, and she has TB. She's always reading Marx and Tolstoy, and she wants to fall in love, but all the men that she meets are kind of intellectually weak, in her opinion. So it's just an amazing feminist novel that I adore.
Please also tell us about what you're reading. Are you reading
Like-
anything outside of this?
Yeah, well, right now I can't read it all because we're just like racing around. So I'm actually, when you ask me that, I'm literally drawing a blank. But I have some books in my suitcase. I'm trying to read Beloved Rangamala by is it Shireen Akhtar? Or Shaheen Akhtar. Shaheen Akhtar, translated by my friend Shabnam Nadia, so that is on the agenda, yeah. But yeah, I'm dead tired right now, so.
Naturally, you're
Yeah.
just roaming around from one place to
Yeah,
another.
exactly.
So for the last question, I wanted to ask that Samadhi and Mohsen, they read like very different books, right? Like both of them still prose poems in their own right, in their own languages. How did you manage to do that? Because that's quite an arduous task. Just to start thinking of translating that book is a task in itself, in my opinion.
Yeah.
To do that and make it a very flowing prose poem in its target audience language. How was that? And second, to have a follow-up question to that, how is your experience of translating Hamara Shaher? Like, how is that different or is that similar to?
Okay, so I think one thing about Raid Samadhi that I didn't understand till I was actually done is that it's really like a huge prose poem. And so that made it very, very difficult to translate, and I had to recreate rhythms and things like the way you do with poetry, because there's hardly any sentences that are just like, she walked across the room and, opened the cabinet, or, like there's, none of it is like that. And so, it's a huge poem, and so poetry you have to transform in all different ways, and, like capturing feelings and rhythms and that kind of thing. So that's one thing. And then of course Hamare Shaher Us Baras is very different. Much earlier work, much less experimental, even though, I mean, it has its experimental elements, and you certainly see the seeds of that other writing are in there, and even images and things like that you see transferred, but it's still easier in some ways, but surprisingly uneasy in other ways. Like, you may think as a reader, because you're reading it, that, oh, this is much simpler. But she still has these strange images that, like, once you break them down, you think, wait, what is she doing? You know, and that take a lot of work to recreate in a kind of comprehensible form. Like right in the first page, I think there's this thing about the teeth and gums being compared to the flowers on a vine. And that took me quite a while to unpack that. And you have to read the whole book to really understand why she put it there in the first place. Like it comes very near the end. It's foreshadowing. But yeah, I had to read the whole book to be able to translate this 1 or 2 sentences at the beginning.
Daisy, squeezing in one last question.
Okay.
Sorry. You also translate from Urdu.
Yes.
So you translate from Hindi as well.
Yeah.
So do you have 2 different sort of processes for these 2 languages? I mean, how do you make sure that you don't carry over you don't have a hangover from Urdu when you do Hindi or vice versa?
Well,
I mean, that's not a right phrase, but I don't know exactly.
No, I mean, it's the same process, but the literatures are different in the sense that Urdu is like a much more set kind of medium. So I can find all the words I need in the dictionary pretty much, whereas Hindi people are making stuff up all the time, or it's like out of dialects and things like that. So Urdu is a much clearer path, even though I came to Urdu later, so my vocabulary is pretty weak. So I do have to look up a lot of words, but on the other hand, it's a more straightforward kind of process.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Daisy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.